Welcome to Changing Minds with your host, King of the Broad-Minded Thinkers, Daryl Davis. Presenting guests with original thought-provoking content,
bringing you wider perspectives on things you know, and challenging you with information you've never considered. Tired of the same old, same old? This is the place to be.
Changing Minds.
Welcome to Changing Minds. I'm your host, Daryl Davis. This is a children's story, but a children's story all adults need to hear. Most of us are familiar with the numerous fairy tales from our childhood that begin with the four words, once upon a time, and end with the four words, lived happily ever after. Well, folks, this is not a fairy tale, but a real-life story of a child who could have been your child, the child next door, or any number of children whose lives could have been lived happily ever after. In keeping with the childhood story tradition, I will start with, once upon a time, there was a boy named Jesse Morton. Jesse was a bright, intelligent, and gifted child who proved it later by graduating as valedictorian from Metropolitan College of New York, and subsequently earned his master's degree in international studies from Columbia University. But growing up, life was not so rosy and fairy tale-like for Jesse. He suffered constant physical abuse from his mother, who beat and bit him. He ran away from home as a teenager, and his life took a very different path. He changed his name to Yunus Abdullah Muhammad and became a jihadist, an Islamic extremist, and one of the chief recruiters for Al-Qaeda here in the United States to further the mission and vision of Osama bin Laden. Some of his influence and recruiting tactics would eventually lead to some followers plotting to commit murder and others detonating a bomb at the Boston Marathon. After serving time in federal prison, today Yunus Abdullah Muhammad is back to being Jesse Morton and has transformed his life into being one of the top counter-extremism workers in the country, working alongside the FBI and even partnering with the top NYPD intelligence and counter-violent extremism director who brought about his arrest. Here to tell the rest of the story in his own words is Jesse Morton. Welcome to the show, Jesse.
Thank you for having me, Daryl. It's good to be here.
Thank you for coming. Really appreciate it.
Honored.
Well, let's start at the beginning. Let's go back to childhood, because these things just don't drop out of the sky and hit you. And so many people who get recruited into supremacist or extremist type groups, while some of them come from excellent, well-raised families and things like that, there is a lot of dysfunctional ones as well. And speak to that a little bit, if you would, to your childhood.
There's so many different ways that one can start the story of their life. The narratives that we tell about ourselves have very serious implications for the behaviors and the things that we end up doing in our life. And so I guess what we think about when we talk about the relationships between trauma and radicalization into violent extremism, if you will, is a simple recognition that a lot of people in our world feel unnoticed. And I guess that is really the core of how I formulated a personality that became something incredibly sinister, but had all of the necessary ingredients to redirect those energies and those concerns in a more positive direction. I was born in a rural town. It's not even really a town in Pennsylvania. It's called Winfield, Pennsylvania. It's barely even on the map. The reason that was the case was because my father, he was from New Jersey, and he was a sort of upper class rich kid whose father himself was an attorney set to be the youngest Supreme Court justice in the state of New Jersey ever. And during the senior year of my father's high school, his father passed away out of nowhere. So this part of my family comes from affluent all the way back to sons and daughters of the American Revolution. My father's side of the family came on the Mayflower. I'm a direct descendant of Samuel Adams, et cetera, on this side. And my father brings to a small town in Pennsylvania an interest after his father passed away to go to pre-law school at a very small private university called Susquehanna University in the hills outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He, at the same time, gets drawn to a countercultural movement that's budding at the time, largely the late 1960s, and sort of this sort of far left drop out of society altogether. And he becomes what was known back then as a beatnik. meets my mother, who's a local rural working class woman from a very underprivileged background, because this college is nested inside of a very small community, a working class community. He impregnates my mother, and back then, when you impregnated a woman, you married them. It was much more a cultural norm. And so they decided that they were going to move to a sort of a communal type of living situation. And for the first 2 or 3 years of life, it was basically a bliss. Out in the middle of nowhere, I grew up with my father growing marijuana in the woodshed, farming and organic food, renting an old farmhouse. And I imagine that things were relatively smooth.
So this was back in the 1960s?
Yeah, I was born in 1978. This is in the late 70s by this point. But my father's influence had been more the countercultural movement from the late 60s. And it played a really important part in my childhood, because constantly on the shelves and around me were the books of Jack Kerouac, right? Ken Kesey. The Grateful Dead was on the on LP on the shelf, and on the vinyl record, Bob Dylan, things of this nature. And it sounded good. But in reality, the way that sort of trauma inside of my own father, having lost his father and having come from a very difficult sort of circumstance where he identified in a way where he wanted to leave society altogether, essentially, bred a little bit of dysfunction that first formulated as my father starting to commit adultery against my mother. And losing interest in being an engaged father. He became a workaholic. My mother, on her side, comes from a very, working class, sort of uneducated, sort of very closed idea of what the world is. Very small town mentality. And she was enthralled by my father and his more urban sort of, different upbringing. And she was in love with my father to a degree that when he started to cheat on her, the anger and the animosity started to get severe. And what she did, being that she was living out in the middle of nowhere, being that she was frustrated and in pain and in anguish, people that, are hurt, they hurt other people. And my mother probably had a confounding sort of mental health complication that went along with it. But at one point, my earliest memory is my mother actually beating me. So she started to abuse her children. And so I grew up in the middle of nowhere, where no one could hear the screams and no one could hear the cries of constantly being badgered and assaulted and brandished, what we might call in the familial studies of dysfunction, the black sheep or the scapegoat in a dysfunctional family. The one who was rendered responsible for the dysfunction. But in actuality, oftentimes what we see is that's the individual with the strongest personality that kind of holds the glue together and is willing to absorb the pain and the frustration that's going on in the house. So years went by, and my father's sort of far leftist dreams slowly started to fall apart. He became a construction worker. We barely got by. We lived in pretty much severe and rampant poverty. And the situation got more and more dire, to the point where even my little sister, the fragile little girl that she was getting beat, was getting choked, was getting spit on, was getting assaulted physically and mentally, was probably even in some ways worse. And at the same time, there was a dynamic where my younger brother and sister were pit against me by my mother. And all of these things formulate a personality in me. And it's very important to understand these dynamics, because I think when we're children and we're observing the world, we oftentimes look at children as not capable of understanding what's going on around them. But I was very cognizant of the fact that I was absorbing pain and suffering as a result of my father's neglect. And I get to a point where I'm willing to absorb that pain. I believe that it is my purpose of my existence. I start to intervene when my mother starts to beat my sister. I start to say, no, you're going to beat me. And I start to see myself as someone who's willing to sacrifice for a greater cause.
Now, did this happen in your father's presence? And he did nothing to intervene and stop it?
So the situation was very dire, because my father was a workaholic with a mistress. So I would wait on top of the stairs at night for my father to come home, knowing that the day was really rough. For example, he would come in the door 10:30 at night. My mother would assault him and accuse him of cheating, ask him just to tell her he was cheating so that she could leave. She would take the glasses off his face, wrinkle his glasses, punch him, smack him, and he would just be passive aggressive and stare her down. I would sit on the top of the steps thinking in my head, just tell her, man, stop. You have to be compassionate with this woman. What are you doing? Why are you torturing her like this? And in frustration would then go back to my room, try to fall back asleep, and know the next day was going to be a very brutal one. My father would get called home. My mother would call and she would say, come home and pick up your son. He's being bad, of course, right? He'd pick me up. I'd have bite marks all up and down the inside of my thighs, to the degree where sometimes he'd take me to my mother's mother, my grandmother, and he'd show her the bites. He'd show her the scratches. He'd show her the marks of clumps of hair that had been pulled out of my head. And my grandmother was appalled, but would simply take me into the room and just tell me that someday it's going to be okay. No one wanted to call the police on their daughter, right? And I went to school and I developed a way where there's this sort of unrecognized warning from your abuser when you're enduring child abuse, where we'd be driving to school. We lived out in the middle of nowhere. My mother would drive us to school. She'd grab my sister's hair, spit on her, call her ugly, call her stupid. And I would sit in the back. I couldn't really intervene and stop it. So we'd all be shaking. She'd slam on the brakes, drop us off outside of the front of the school. We'd go into the restroom and I'd wipe my sister's hair down, wipe the spit out of her hair, kiss her on the forehead, tell her to be strong. And we just kept that little secret between us because we felt like it would keep us safe.
Was your mom abused as a child in similar fashion, or do you know?
This is a question that oftentimes comes up, and what I really think now is, in retrospect, no, not at that level, at that generation. But I do know for a fact that some of the sort of enraged bipolar symptoms that my mother expresses are very similar to what's reported from my grandfather. His mother. So what would have been my great grandmother had apparently fits of rage. She had grew up in upstate New York and had gotten impregnated by a Native American Indian and had to flee to Pennsylvania as a result of a biracial marriage. So they were always stigmatized, and she had to grow up single, and he had to take care of her, and reports very similar abuse that he suffered as a child. So in some senses, maybe more biological than something she experienced herself.
Yeah. So eventually these beatings and bitings led to your running away from home.
Yeah. I mean, after this is where you transition. I adopted this sort of like I guess one of the ways we could put it is when we study trauma, we're starting to understand the relationships between the body, the mind, and the heart. And so the body keeps the score, if you will. I could not control my behavior. I was completely out of body, if you will, and drifting, almost like I was just floating on an ocean looking for something to pick me up. And what was picking me up was, I grew up in working class town, and all of my friends were starting to use heroin. Things were starting to get really difficult. And I went to a guidance counselor at school when I was about 14. And I told the guidance counselor about the abuse for the first time in my life. The guidance counselor called my mother in, asked my mother, and told her, and she explained to him that I was simply trying to get out of trouble, and that basically my brother and me were fighting over the weekend, and that she doesn't beat me. And she came home, she hugged me, she apologized. My sister says she felt like she was so proud of me because the abuse was going to end. And then about 2 hours later, she gave both me and my sister about the worst beating that we had experienced to that point. It was at that time that I started to realize that I'm either going to hurt myself or I'm going to get out of here. I started to experience a lot of rage, and I got in trouble for possessing marijuana and was sent to live with my grandmother in Ohio for 6 months. And it was there that I learned that I can get back in my body. As long as I don't have to live under the anxiety of my home, I can manage my own affairs. And so when it was time to move back, and to move in with my mother and father, who were moving into a new house and were still married because of economic circumstances, I made it about a month. And about 30 days having moved back home at the age I was approaching 16, I took off and ended up taking Route 80 from the town where I live in. It's about 2.5 hours outside of New York City. Ended up in New York City behind Port Authority at a drop-in center called The Open Door.
You mentioned the Grateful Dead album being on your shelf. There came a time when you followed the Grateful Dead, mm-hmm. and you had a job as you're self-employed as a drug dealer.
Sort of, yes, indeed. So yeah, I mean, so what I was basically looking for was to find roots on my father's side of the family. I realize that now. So he was from Cranford, New Jersey, right outside of New York City. So it was quite natural that where I first started my runaway status was in downtown Manhattan, where I was exposed to the New York City sort of culture that was really, appealed to me. And it let me sort of come into contact with a world outside the closed realm I had grown up in, full of abuse. one day I was in 42nd Street and 8th Avenue, and all these hippies started showing up with dreadlocks running around. You know, when the hippies come to town back then, particularly this is the late 90s, you know, they basically shut the city down. You could see them everywhere. There's tens of thousands more present in the city that they would be playing the band in than there actually were going into the concert or the show. I met some people that were on their way to a concert in Albany, New York, a Grateful Dead show in Albany, New York. And I ended up going to my very first Grateful Dead show, and it was there that I found my first ability to identify a countercultural movement that kind of spoke to me and gave me an ability to find an identity in something greater than myself. And I became a Deadhead almost immediately and ended up traveling with the Grateful Dead for about 3.5, 4 years, meeting all of the members of the band and knowing the music inside out. It became something that was for me like a religion. And it's in some senses the very first example of a radical network that I was able to engage with and belong to. And it put forth a lifestyle of living that was conducive with theirs, which was very unhealthy for a traumatized boy to be learning how to manage their own life and surrounded by LSD, hallucinogenics, substances, and then also traveling with the dead. It creates an opportunity for runaway kids to sort of sell drugs to get by. And so I gravitated and became somewhat of a distributor of hallucinogenics for people going into concerts. That gave me sustenance, gave me something to do, gave me a sort of entrepreneurial spirit to myself. And I thought that things were, for the first time, going to go well. But of course, that was followed up with addiction and all other complications.
So in layman terms, a distributor of hallucinogenics, in other words, is a drug dealer.
Yes.
Okay. So eventually this drug dealing or distributing would lead to your arrest.
Yes. My first arrest was in Penn State University at a concert. I was arrested with quite a bit of LSD, mushrooms, marijuana, and was incarcerated for the first day. And was woken to the sound of a guard saying, "Do you want to go to the library to get a book?" Of course I did. I didn't know what jail was like. I couldn't find anything in this State College. Pennsylvania is in a very small town, like Penn State University is in a small town. So I was in this really, sort of dingy county jail. And I go to the basement library, and there's Westerns, there's romance novels, not a whole lot to read that was donated by the community. But I found one book that was particularly intriguing. The Autobiography of Malcolm X. And I took it back to the cell and I read it first way through. I could not stop. I think I read it 3 or 4 times in about 3 or 4 days. I was mesmerized by Malcolm's story. Here was a person who had grown up, experienced trauma, discrimination, stigmatization, had transferred his drug lifestyle into something that became an asset in promoting this new identity. And I didn't think the identity that Malcolm adopted with the Nation of Islam was for me until he hit the part where he goes to Mecca and he walks around the Kaaba with, white people with blue eyes, and he comes back and he, denounces the Nation of Islam and accepts Sunni Islam. And it was such a powerful narrative for me that it just grabbed me. And so what I basically did was before I even converted to Islam, I saw it as an outlet to become something significant. And I found in myself an archetypal hero in Malcolm that I wanted to embody. But all of those traumas and all of those pains, and I think that Malcolm, was figuring these things out too. And I think that there is a very serious lessons that we can learn from Malcolm, and particularly from his short life and the realizations that he was coming to. I was really angry, and I wanted a outlet to project my anger into. And now I wasn't just angry at my mother, I was angry at myself because I wasn't succeeding. I was getting older. I was 20 years old, and I was scared. And I was scared that I was going to be a failure. And I was looking for something to latch onto. And so that first jail stint ended up being about 4.5 months. It was nothing major. First time you get in trouble, of course, it's not that serious in life, but it set me off when I left there with a keen interest in religion and studying all the different religions, but particularly the religion of Islam. And so I continued to live a negative lifestyle, but I continued to be on the side reading these books, recognizing that while I never thought I would believe in organized religion, maybe religion was something I needed because I was falling deeper and deeper into addiction. Now I was using heroin and crack cocaine more frequently. I started to get high off my own supply, if you will, or at least hustle to get money to get high.
Let me pause for a second. So the biography, or autobiography rather, of Malcolm X is the book that you gravitated towards and took back to the cell and read over and over again and had a profound effect on you. Mm-hmm. Would you say that if it had been a book on Christianity or on Judaism or on Mormonism or Buddhism or Hinduism, it would have had the same effect? You would have gone in that direction? Was it just something that you were just looking for, or there was something in particular about Islam that superseded all others?
Well, what I found in Malcolm's story wasn't so much about the religion. It was about the ability to take a religion and to transfer it into a social justice sensation. And I was already adopted very far leftist, much more anarchist political views than my hippie friends, who were mostly not interested in society at all. I was revolutionary to some degree at the undercurrent. And that was a manifestation of my anger and frustration and my hatred of my society for not intervening, protecting me from the abuse. And so now I realize these things in retrospect, but it was the desire to be worldly and spiritual at the same time that grabbed me. So I don't know for certain if it would have been true. And I also think the more and more I study violent extremism, and that I don't want to go off into a tangential, that people find interpretations of religions and movements and ideologies that coincide with their traumas and their pain. So I probably was looking as a person who had no ability to be risk averse. I probably was looking for something that could have been an avenue towards excitement and probably significance and recognition that I actually wasn't necessarily an absolutely evil person, something to offer. But that hatred of self manifested as hatred for society from a very early age. My traveling with the hippies led me to pretty much denounce all of what was mainstream American society. And I didn't have much contact with it for all of those years. So in a sense, I was a runaway kid that was hindered and harmed. And what Malcolm did was he offered some sense of a fatherly figure in my life, if you will, at least a model for what I could do, that it wasn't too late. And then studying religions upon release, I found Islam is very much something that considers itself compatible with science. That the narrative in the Islamic religion is very powerful because you can still believe in the Judaic prophets, you can still believe in Jesus, and they do. And it was a powerful and throwing narrative, but it wasn't really the religion that made me convert. It was the idea that in Islam I had an identity that could basically heal me, but also give me something new to belong to, because I hated Jesse Morton. I literally didn't care if Jesse Morton at this point lived or died. And Malcolm gave me hope. And really, there's very few books in the world that are as powerful as the Autobiography of Malcolm X. It is an absolute masterpiece. There's plenty of masterpieces that came along. And yeah, I think if it was the right masterpiece written in the right way to attract the right young mind, it could have certainly lured me in. But I think that Malcolm's refusal to absolutely denounce violence, particularly in the stage of his most, sort of radicalized process in life, satisfied my own desires, my own anger. I think that I had come to the conclusion that this idea of social change, but the idea that it has to be based on turn the other cheek and drop out of society and not get involved, is absolutely nonsensical. So I had already arrived at that conclusion in my mind.
So somewhere during that time in prison, you adopted the name Yunus Abdullah Muhammad.
Well, this is actually, when I left that first jail bit, and it's hard because my life story is full of criminality, I ended up, continuing to travel around with the hippies and continuing to live on the streets and gravitating towards narcotics usage while reading and looking for this possible outlet that would be religion. I was totally open to the idea of converting, but I didn't want to be a hypocrite. I knew I was still using drugs. And all of a sudden, I'm on the streets of Philadelphia, and I'm hustling with a guy who's a Salafist Muslim, who's in Philadelphia. They have a phenomenon in North Philly, particularly, where there's a large Salafi community that goes and studies in Saudi Arabia and impacts the society and the culture to a certain degree, where a lot of people in the prison system particularly come out of prison with an Islamic identity, but it's difficult, no matter what you believe in, to exercise behaviors that coincide with that. So this individual was a fundamentalist hustling downtown Philadelphia. And we were engaged in trying to, sell drugs in order to get high. We ended up in North Philly, coming out of the projects. Cops shined flashlights on us, told us to lay down. We didn't. We ran into what they call in Philly an abandonmenium, hiding behind drywall. And he says, repeat these words after me and everything will be okay. And he reads to me the declaration of faith in Arabic of the Muslim language. I have no clue what I'm even doing or saying. All I know is that we got away. And in my mind, it was a miracle, maybe because of the words that we had uttered. We get into a cab and he tells me we're going to go to my wife's house, tell her you converted to Islam and she'll let you stay. So I do. I go to sleep. They go into the bedroom and fall asleep. I go to sleep on the couch. I wake up and I'm getting ready to go to the bathroom. And on my left side, I see the Quran open on the table. And I grab it and I pick it up. And the very first verse I read, it says, this is a book wherein there's no doubt, a guidance for people of consciousness. And I start to read it and I feel, for whatever reason, I just felt calm. I felt like I have to take this step now. And so the interesting thing is when he wakes up, they take me to the mosque. I actually convert to Islam. I don't even know how to pray. I have no money left because of the catastrophe that was the night before. I stow away on a Greyhound bus. I ride to Richmond, Virginia, where there's a hippie concert from a guitarist that plays for Fish, a band that was popular at the time. And I get arrested for selling fake drugs to an undercover cop. So they put me on an open cell block in Richmond City Jail with no bond because I have no local Virginia address. So I can't get out. I have to wait. I know I'm going to leave because the drugs are fake. But when they put me outside the open cell block, I have dreadlocks, I look dirty, I'm nasty, but I had just converted to Islam the day before in Philadelphia. And here comes a young Arab man, maybe 35 years old at the time, kufi on his head, maybe probably a little older than this, Moroccan, it's 1999. No, it's 2000. He takes my mattress, puts it under his bunk, and allows me to sit. And no one else in the city jail will give me a spot. So I tell him I'm Muslim. And he doesn't really believe me, but he starts to teach me my religion. He teaches me how to pray. He teaches me the rules. Late at night, we stay up, we read the Quran. Everything is spiritual. I find like this is destiny. Then he tells me, now that you know how to pray in Arabic and that you're praying with the brothers, you have to go to the shower, wash every inch of your body. I'm going to give you a new name. When you actually convert to Islam, everything you've done up until your life now is forgiven. It's erased. And you're going to start a new life. And I'm going to give you a new name, Yunus Abdullah Muhammad. This is music to my ears because I hate Jesse Morton. I can't stand him. I just wish that he would die or do something to die at this point. I go in, I shower myself. I feel like, wow, I'm really like picturing myself washing all of my life away. I come out, they're dressed in white. They sit me down. I put my hand on the Quran. I take my actual declaration of faith because in fundamentalist Islam, knowledge has to precede action. You have to know why you're believing in what you're believing in. And things get relatively stable. At one point, we're praying and it's early in the morning. We call the adhan and it wakes an inmate up. And the inmate comes and stands in front of the prayer. The Moroccan, he's a veteran of the Afghan-Soviet jihad. He started to talk a little bit about politics, but not much. The individual stands in front of the prayer and he tries to move him to the right. He doesn't budge. So this little guy gets up and he starts to fight and he gets beat up really bad. They take him to the back of the cell block where he's healing. He's my bunkie. He let me sleep with him. So I am responsible for making sure and checking in and making sure he's okay. And I don't understand. Why did you get violent? I didn't understand to this degree. He explains to me that Muslims always have to be like David battling Goliath. He says that right now, what we don't understand is that the Muslims, they lost their dignity. And he tells me about Afghanistan and the Taliban, and he gives me a hadith from the Prophet Muhammad, a narration that the Prophet says that if someone comes and stands in front of your prayer, gently move them to the right. But if they refuse to move, then get up and fight them because they're a devil. And he starts to explain to me this principle of shaitan and how shaitan manifests himself in people and how the people, they hate real Islam and how the Taliban has established Sharia law in Afghanistan and how there's a prophecy that says the black flag of jihad will be raised in Afghanistan and it won't be stopped until it reaches Jerusalem. And he tells me about Israel and the Middle East, which I'm already familiar with because as someone who is far leftist, this is a big grievance. So it makes the religion now one about dignity, 2, about power, 3, about being David versus Goliath, which is something I saw myself in my household as a young child. And he tells me that it is my duty to go call the people to Islam, that the West and the Muslims will definitely engage in combat and confrontation for the rest of my existence on earth, and that I should play a part in being on the side of the truth.
Here in the States, most Muslims are black. There are a number of white Muslims. Were you readily accepted as a white Muslim with dreadlocks?
Well, I shaved one of the things that within 2 weeks I had to shave the dreads. The dreads disappeared at his mandate, because dreadlocks apparently, in his interpretation of the religion, if you had dreadlocks and you were to pray, your prayer would not be accepted. And that's, fundamentalism. In the jail as a white convert, you are sort of an aberration, and the majority of the inmate population is African American. But they gave me some of the only examples of unconditional love I had experienced in my life up until that point. They were very welcoming. I was a Muslim brother. If I said I was a Muslim, I was a Muslim. I ate with them. I prayed with them, got to know them. And I was still coming out of a very traumatized circumstance where my addiction is starting to wear off while I'm learning this religion, and I'm preparing to go out and try to drop all of these things that were plaguing me. But yeah, I was kind of accepted. When the drugs came back from the lab, I was immediately released. I didn't know where to go. And I chose to go to Syracuse Salvation Army. Was the only place I could find a bed in. And so right before 9/11, here comes a white Muslim convert to a Christian program that wants to be a fundamentalist and has dropped all of the alcohol, all of the smoking, everything, completely abandoned it, and went on this path of praying 5 times a day, fasting, rigorously studying my religion, and just jumped all in. So this radicalization in the prison system really set me forth on a trajectory where I now had a new identity. I now had a new self, Yunus Abdulrahman.
Okay, now you used the word jihad a moment ago. For our listeners, explain the definition of jihad. We know it's thrown around quite a bit. Sometimes it's misdefined and so forth and so on.
So in the language, jihad comes from a verb, jahada, which means to struggle for something, to strive for something. And so jihad can be struggling against your own self in the commission of sins, and it can be struggling in your society for social justice and for rights and for God's way, if you will. Or in the religion of Islam, it can be righteous self-defense with regard to combat and with regard to violence, taken to the extremes by many, many, many Muslims. It would be unfair to suggest that that is not the case. However, in the root of the language, it simply means to purify yourself, and as a consequence of purifying yourself, work to purify your society, not by force.
And over here, it's commonly thought of as holy war. So let's move on. How did you come in contact with Al-Qaeda, and then you became one of the chief recruiters for Al-Qaeda in this country? So
I was converting and fundamentalizing or becoming a fundamentalist on my own, and then 9/11 happens out of nowhere. I'm in Syracuse Salvation Army, laying low as a Muslim. Everyone knows I'm a Muslim. Everyone knows I'm going to the library, reading a lot of books on Islam, gravitating towards, Noam Chomsky and other political works as well. And here comes 9/11. The people at the program came in with rubber gloves on because it was reported that I was praying. And they found Arabic literature in a pillowcase. And I understand now because there was a lot of hysteria after the 9/11 attacks. It was a tragedy. I was asked to leave the program. They didn't think it was a good fit for me and asked where I wanted to go. And I said, well, send me back to New York City. So within a matter of days, I was in New York City, didn't know what to do, wanted to hold on to my religion, went to a shelter in New York City, got authorization to go into a program in Harlem, New York, on 145th Street and Edgecombe Avenue. It's called Striver's House. It's a really beautiful program run by people that worked alongside of Malcolm X. So here I am, radicalizing, so to say. 9/11, George Bush says, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. I didn't really understand what the us meant. I didn't really like America that much already. And so in a sense, I was interested in what the terrorists had to say. So I start absorbing online and in any way capacity that I could get it, whether it was in person at the mosque community in New York City or not, information related to political Islam from the Muslim Brotherhood all on up. And so it was a self-taught phenomenon at first. And I'm living in New York and I'm walking around the streets that Malcolm walked on. I'm going to the same mosques. And I find people like me because I'm a white convert that has an ability to live in Harlem and to get along with everyone because of the experiences I've been in life. So I was welcomed into the community and I became, an articulate convert that was able to get people to understand why they should convert to Islam. So on 125th Street, a bookseller starts to take me and he asked me to tell the people about the Iraq War and to talk about the stuff that I was talking about in the mosque and in private conversations in the community, and to use it to get people to buy conspiracy theory books. They have a lot of stuff like Malachi York, who, most people don't know about, but, Dr. York's books are like more conspiratorial. They're a synthesis of religions, and they have a lot of appeal to people that are looking for conspiracy theories to believe in. And so I would espouse anti-war sloganing, but also talk to people in Harlem about their ancestry and its connection to West Africa and Islam. And they came before Columbus. And I had a very good spiel that would sometimes let people walk with me to the mosque to convert, and a lot of times let people stop and buy books from the bookseller. But I was drawn to the fact that people wanted to hear what I had to say. And I felt power. I felt empowered. At the same time, the program that I was participating in was so good that the vocational educational counselor at the facility looked me in the eyes and said, "You're pretty smart. Why don't you try to go to college?" And I said, "Well, I can't take out loans because I'm a Muslim. So I don't think that that's an option for me." And she convinced me to continue to try to just go see what would happen. And I had gotten a scholarship to a private school, Metropolitan College in New York, where I would later graduate as a valedictorian and go on to, continue to pursue an academic education. So on one side, my life was getting stable for the first time, and I was exercising my ability to utilize that stability to heal my trauma. But on this other aspect, I still had this person on my shoulder that was calling me to significance and to get enthralled with something new. I wanted something new to believe in, and I really, truly cared. I really thought that what I was doing was speaking out on behalf of the Iraqi people. So as that progressed and as my public speaking skills increased, I went to a Muslim Day parade one year, and long story short, I found my very first radical Islamic group. I didn't know one existed, a very small handful of individuals operating out of Jackson Heights, New York, who were affiliated with a radical preacher in London called Omar Bakri Muhammad and an organization called Autobiography. They were called the Islamic Thinkers Society, and they were doing very provocative things that were getting them on like Fox News, and they were getting a lot of publicity because this is now 2004, 2005. The Iraq War is heating up. Concern for jihadism is at its peak. And I walk up to them and they were selling T-shirts saying, I love jihad and things like this in Arabic. And I didn't even ask. I simply said, I want to join you. And the teacher, the sheikh that ran that show, was directly affiliated with Omar Bakri Muhammad and Anjem Choudhury and all of the sort of al-Qaeda affiliated leadership that had gone to and established a home in Europe. And so that early bridge was born that way.
It's important to mention at this point, I think that, because just like, there are different forms of Christianity in this country, there are different forms of Islam, and not all Islam is extremist, terrorist, and all that kind of thing, as too many people here in our country perceive it to be because of the 9/11 attacks. That is not the true Islam, and you differentiated it by saying radical Islam. We also have radical Christianity here as well. So you got affiliated with these people from Al-Qaeda, and you went on to become a propagandist and published you published the first online magazine for terrorists, essentially.
Well, basically, yeah. What we did, what happened was I joined this group. I rose in the ranks. I took it very seriously. I ended up becoming their chief speaker. They were called the Islamic Thinkers Society. But they wanted to operate in person in New York City. But there was this new phenomenon that was occurring where everyone was going to use social media platforms, right? So most of the discourse by this time was occurring on outlets like Facebook, right? Twitter had just started. YouTube was rising in prominence and people were utilizing it. I was more interested in decentralizing the message of the jihadists and taking it so that everyday people could come in contact with it. And that's essentially what we did. I partnered with a charismatic Jamaican preacher who was getting ready to be deported from prison in Britain. And as soon as he touched down in Jamaica, he called me. We had established written correspondence. And he said, basically, we were going to take his message, which he studied in Saudi Arabia, was directly affiliated with all of Al-Qaeda's, teachers and preachers throughout the years. And he had radicalized 7/7 bombers, Jermaine Lindsay in particular, one of the 7/7 bombers in London, 2005, now was deported. But Jamaica gave him sort of a safe haven. Because they didn't really have a problem with him that much. And so what we did was we took his presence in Jamaica and his Bob Marley / Malcolm X interpretation of Islam. He really he gave it to you in a flavor that the West could understand it. And we translated it so that now the lectures that were coming from Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, Waziristan, or wherever, that were an hour and a half long, heavily dense, only in Arabic, could now be translated into English, chopped up. The key themes could be teased out, and we could present them in a way where Western youth would find appeal to them. The
Western youth and people over here thought this magazine, this online magazine and recruiting tool was coming out of the Middle East or something, when actually it was coming out of your apartment in New York City. Yes.
So what we did was, at that time, we had seen a groundswell of support. They laughed at us. We started our own organization in 2007 called Revolution Muslim. And the idea of Revolution Muslim was to do that, to take revolutionary rhetoric and combine it with Islam so that we could make a jihadism that crazy Western youth and misfits would adopt. And I did that with Samir Khan and Anwar al-Awlaki and Abdullah Faisal and all of these chief leaders. It was coordinated behind closed doors. It was planned that way. It was sort of a natural evolution, but we knew how potent this message was going to become. And one of the ways that we realized we could really raise alarm was if we put together a glossy English language magazine that looked like something that would be produced by the fashion industry for jihadists, with jihadi cool culture, with good graphic design, with well-written articles. And we published what was called Jihad Recollections and launched it into the ether on jihadist forums, which is why everyone thought that it came from the Middle East, because the first place we launched it in order to give that appearance was in the jihadist forums, which are predominantly populated back then by people in the Middle East and jihadists abroad. They trickled their way down. The press caught them. They called it Al-Qaeda's Vanity Fair. And really, it was not a jihadist import to the West. It was an American export to the Middle East. What we did was, alongside of not just the magazines, but the way that we utilized the internet, we had really exciting sort of YouTube videos. We started to get good at graphic design on the video processes. We had moving graphics. We started to appear on outlets like Russia Today, Press TV, CNN, Fox News. We manipulated the mainstream media. We created this big network that led to exponential growth and support for Salafi jihadism in the West, and it shocked the entire world. People really couldn't understand why this extremism was taking a hold from amongst very fringe segments of the Muslim population. And then what we nefariously did, which was horrible and probably the worst consequence of what I did, was we deliberately would go out and promote the idea that we wanted to take over American constitutional law and implement Sharia here in the United States. And we did it with documentarians that were from the anti-Islamic crowd. So we deliberately fed anti-Muslim narratives so that we could create the us versus them world that we wanted. So we would give the narrative that Muslims are here to take over. When they would espouse the narrative and it would impact Muslims with Islamophobia, we would then point to them and say, see, they'll never accept you, right? In a way that was sort of tactical as a recruitment tool. And so in a very manipulative way, we built, I think you could say, a complete holistic ecosystem of 24/7 information that was Salafi jihadism, very effectively designed, graphic design, magazines connected to 24/7, sort of lecturing online and interaction with the scholars. We had a website, we had Facebook, we used YouTube, we used Pal Talk, we used Office, and spread this ideology in a very dangerous, anyone can do it themselves type lone wolf way. Okay, so this being a children's story for adults, what is it that adults, parents, etc.,
can look for? What are the telltale signs that they should be looking for in their children who might be susceptible to I mean, because you recruited teenagers as well. Mm-hmm. You're not doing that today, but somebody is. Mm-hmm. So with your expertise, please share with our listeners, what is it that parents might be missing?
Well, in the situation of jihadism, it's important to understand one thing that I'm learning even more and more about, and I'm even more confident than ever in saying, is that extremism is extremism is extremism. And so the telltale signs of extremism is the beginning of to identify an in-group and an out-group, right? Where you start to see a dehumanization either of the Jews, and you could be a jihadist or you could be a far right-wing extremist and start to express anti-Semitic sentiment, even if it's a little bit unnoticeable, or maybe even if it's attached to humor. Racial jokes that seem to be just simply humorous would be an indicator of far right-wing extremism. So what you'll start to see an identity fusing with that of a person you don't know. It's almost as if the person around you is becoming distant. And if you are a parent that's concerned and you're paying attention, which unfortunately, this might be the very root cause of the problem, that a lot of parents aren't paying attention, right, to the identities that are formulating in their young people. You will start to recognize that there will be an absorption of literature that is around one theme, is highly political, and at least has a sort of spiritual component to it, but it's more political than it is religious. But it's almost as if you're watching a conversion take place. You'll also notice that in your mind, it might be perceived to be a good thing. Because think about my conversion. I went to college. It gave me stability where there was none. It was healthy for me. It gave me stability and focus and something to believe in. However, it's not a healthy interpretation of what you're absorbing. So the telltale signs is really look for symbols, things that indicate there's a belonging to a group, anything that looks like a logo, a flag, or something that is indicative of belonging to something. And if you don't know about it, try to find out what that symbolism means. You'll oftentimes always find symbolism associated with the early stages of radicalization. Look at the rhetoric that's espoused in the house. As soon as you start to see the continued conversation about one ethnic group, or in the case of Muslims, it's a typically anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli rhetoric, or it could be simply kuffar, these terms, the disbelievers. So you'll just start to see a person's identity formulate where they're starting to talk as if they belong to a group and as if they're not an individual. That will be surrounded by symbolism that will be displaying some sort of flag or some sort of marker that suggests a person is engaging with something outside of themselves. And then really one of the key determinants these days is a lot of time online in isolation with little communication about what they are reading or looking at, but you can tell that they're enthralled by whatever it is they're in contact with online, and that it will trickle down into manifestations of speech that start to indicate an in-group, out-group bias formulating, meaning they hate the liberals, they hate commies, they hate Antifa. They hate they hate the kuffar. They hate the Jews. There will be some creeping and some sort of leakage of these types of sentiments at the early stages, in particular, because they're testing the waters. Because basically, the youth view extremism, whether they realize it or not, as a way to be counterculturalist. It's their rebellion.
And this also applies to say here a lot with say white supremacy or black supremacy and things like that. It's the same path.
Yes. But we see, unfortunately, that the more and more concerned we begin, the more and more concern we shed on a particular phenomenon, sometimes haphazardly and counterintuitively, we make it worse. So all of the war against the Muslim and the Islam and the concentration in the war on terror on jihadists, it actually fed interests for those people that are misfits or are looking for something to belong to go do what's taboo and what's considered forbidden and to taste the wine. And right now, we're in a period where the far right has ascended the scale, and for the youth that are interested in finding these possible alternative identities, that happens to be of particular appeal. But these things fluctuate, and extremism is extremism is extremism, and the indicators along the way are very similar.
Yeah, and so in you created the first magazine template that has gone on to be even used today in the movements, and in some of the magazines that advocated for murder of people who cartoonized or drew the Prophet Muhammad, the murder of people who worked on South Park because they featured that, and also inspired the brothers who set off the bomb at the Boston Marathon. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, so the English language jihadi magazines that we created ran for about 4 editions and shocked the world here in the United States. And then an individual from North Carolina who was a colleague of mine named Samir Khan comes to New York City one day and tells us that he's going to go join Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, where another colleague of mine, Anwar al-Awlaki, has already disappeared. And there's not a lot of public commentary, but we all know that he's already with Al-Qaeda. This is the very first time where you have propagandists from the West traveling abroad to join the jihadists and then to continue to speak, because this is what happens. And the way that this happens is, as Samir Khan leaves and goes to Yemen and joins and embeds with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, my organization continues promoting these magazines and these ideas at home. And to raise attention on ourselves and to be extremists and do what extremists do, South Park, the cartoon satire on Comedy Central, announces that it is going to air an episode where they portray the Prophet Muhammad. For the 200th episode, they're going to do the forbidden and they're going to portray the Prophet Muhammad. They did so in a bear suit. It was completely humorous. It was completely pointless to even point out and to even feed. But we took advantage of that and threatened the writers of South Park for portraying the Prophet Muhammad, caused international controversy. A woman out in Seattle starts a Facebook page, everybody draw Muhammad Day. Everybody comes, draws Muhammad. Pakistan, Indonesia threatened to shut down Facebook because Facebook is letting the groups run on the First Amendment grounds. No one knows how to grapple with this new online speech, and we're manipulating it. And so the woman that started the Everybody Draw Muhammad Facebook Day walks away from the project, but her name hits the press. And so my colleagues, Samir Khan and Anwar al-Awlaki, decide we're going to take that magazine template that we created in the United States, and we're going to issue directly from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula the first edition of what became called Inspire magazine. Inspire magazine gave death threat, authorized kill lists against those that insulted Prophet Muhammad, had an article from Anwar al-Awlaki himself, who went on to become the godfather of sort of radicalization and recruitment in the West, and included this really new aspect of the template we created. And it was called open source jihad. Open source jihad was a term that my website used and that they then appropriated. Open source jihad gave you the recipes and the instructions on how to act on the ideas that we were espousing. For the first time, people that spoke perfect idiomatic English and knew how to translate with Westerners in a flashy, glossy, Hollywood-style way had traveled to join Al-Qaeda and had become higher-ups, and now were propagandists projecting from a terrorist organization back into the West in a way that Westerners could understand.
And they advocated murder and they even gave instructions on how to build a bomb.
Yeah, so the article that really set this first open source jihad process that was released in the first edition of Inspire was called How to Build a Bomb in Mom's Kitchen. And of course, when it hit the media, it went viral. I was running to Morocco, so I knew that what we had just done was definitely going to lead to my arrest, and preceded that arrest by getting to Morocco before they could build a case, where my ex-wife is from. So I'm living in Casablanca waiting for the United States government to arrest me or to indict me. I have a sealed indictment. It's not released, but people from the embassy keep trying to reach out and tell me to come to the embassy so I can be arrested. But in the middle of all that, the Arab Spring breaks out. And like all these people that I'm tutoring to go study abroad like a hypocrite, I'm literally teaching them GRE, GMAT, so that they can go get a master's degree in the West, and they're dying to get out of the country, and I'm dying to get in to overthrow it with an Islamic caliphate, so to say. But these conversations start to unfold in the midst of the Arab Spring, where I'm enthralled by the Arab millennial youth and their sort of support for democracy, long story short. Ultimately, I am arrested, and I'm arrested in the context of Syria starting to be that last spot of the Arab Spring where we start to wonder, this thing might go jihad. And I'm arrested and I'm brought back to Alexandria Detention Center in the United States, where I'm facing life in prison.
Alexandria, Virginia.
Yeah. And by that time, I have really started a process of self-reflection, and I have really realized that I probably threw my life away for a cause that was just completely pointless. I was arrested 2 weeks after Osama bin Laden was killed in Abbottabad. While I was in prison in Morocco and Syria was going jihad, my colleagues, Samir Khan and Anwar Al-Awlaki, were killed. And we thought that that would end the Inspire magazine template. Instead, some of my students, while I'm incarcerated, traveled to go to Syria to join Al-Qaeda. And they decide that they're going to take the template I created and they're going to make ISIS's iteration of it. It looks exactly like what we created, same structure, same design. And they called it Dabiq and Rumiyya. And it became a template that was really responsible for activating a lot of drive-by sort of run over, death by car homicide sort of terrorist attacks. A wave of them came from recommendations in that magazine. So I'm incarcerated. I am changing. Long story short, I go in 2011 to 2012. I'm going to the law library again from solitary confinement because this kind guard takes me 10 hours. She works 4 days a week, third shift, 10-hour shifts. She doesn't like solitary confinement. It is kind of torture. And she takes me to the law library. I start to read the Enlightenment philosophers. I start to read the history of America because I'm in Alexandria, Virginia. The donated books there were not romance novels. There was much more to choose from than simply the Autobiography of Malcolm X. There's a vast trove of intellectual, information on the shelf. And I have to say that that's something we need to think about. The literature that we put our citizens in contact with is important. But I get in love and enthralled by the Enlightenment philosophers, and I start to change my thinking. And then everybody thinks the war on terror is over, except for people that, kind of understand how jihadism works, that it's full of spits and starts and that they can go clandestine in the blink of an eye. And they kill my colleagues. And all of a sudden, I'm given an opportunity because my students start to appear abroad in Syria. A lot of the people that we taught and that we influenced start to appear in Syria, who are migrating there. And in 2013, I'm in a prison cell, cooperating now with the FBI. I have, long story short, long conversation with the FBI. I continue to de-radicalize. And when I was sentenced, the prosecuting attorney says that one day the magazine that Morton created is going to be used to kill people. And he tells the judge this straight up. And I'm thinking in my head, there's no way, man. You're not going to pin this on me. I mean, there's no way that's ever going to be implemented because I'm already sort of changed by the time I'm getting sentenced. And the guilt overcomes me. But when I woke up and we found out 2 days after the Boston Marathon bombings that the bombers, the Tsarnaev brothers, used the recipe in Inspire magazine for the very first time, I had to stomach the fact that a piece of propaganda and a template that I and colleagues created had now led to death and destruction. That had they not known how to build the pressure cooker bombs they used, the Boston Marathon, they wouldn't have been able to carry out such atrocities. It would have been much harder anyway. And it was at that point in time where I realized that I really do need to spend the majority of my life, if I want to really be a good person, trying to do whatever I can to make amends for what I have created. And so first it was working with the FBI and giving them information about how to identify trends and strategies and identities and the psychology of the terrorist, and in working as an informant and helping to take some of my students that I created off the battlefield abroad when they were becoming virtual potters. Now people could reach out to them and communicate with them on Twitter, direct message, and then establish relationships that led to several more attempted attacks by people that I knew, that I helped radicalize. And so from that period of thinking that the problem I created was going to expire when we thought the war on terror was winding down until the period when ISIS announced its caliphate, I de-radicalized and was released from prison March 1st, 2015, with a very new set of ideas. Just kind of wanted to go on and live my life, but definitely wasn't radicalized anymore. However, in the context of the reality that the war on terror was very far from over, and that ISIS was here and was something most people thought was something new, but was actually part of a very long historical and evolutionary process, the center of which I had sat within and helped to induce.
Now, you used the word informant a moment ago, working with the FBI. Does that position create any kind of a threat to you from from former colleagues or former members of violent extremism, or current members of violent extremism, I should say?
Yeah. I didn't ever intend to go public. What we did when I came back from prison, it looked like I had just done my time and came home. And so the interesting thing was we made one YouTube video to see if people would actually believe that I was cooperating with government or not. Nobody believed it. All of the old leaders reached out, asked me to speak into the rooms right away. And so I was able to clandestinely operate in a way where, we were just infiltrating these networks with somebody who was considered a higher up, returned home having done their time. It got a lot of intelligence and it saved a lot of lives. But in the process of working in that realm, one of the cases was arrested. There was an arrest, and the prosecuting attorney gave my name at a bond hearing, and a Washington Post reporter ran with it. And it was reported in the Washington Post in February of 2016 that the feds were now working with a former terrorist. And I was out. I had to move. My life was endangered. The FBI made me relocate. I had to hide my whereabouts for quite a long time. And I decided, rather than to live my life like that for the rest of my life, if I was willing to die for the cause as a jihadist, I should be willing to speak up and to say that, I was wrong. And so I started to flirt with the idea of going public as America's first former jihadist right after the Washington Post article was written. And about a year later, after continuing to work on myself and thinking that I was ready, I became a researcher and became America's first former. I still suffer from threats. Until today, I still get threats on a regular basis.
And you've even partnered with the NYPD Director of Intelligence and Counterextremism, who led to your arrest. You've partnered with this person and put together an organization. Yeah,
this is probably the most rewarding thing that I have experienced in life, in all honesty. And I know it's probably difficult for people to understand why, but when we were transitioning the model for radicalization away from the offline in-person conversations into utilizing social media 2.0, NYPD, FBI, and the entire counterterrorism community was faced with a new challenge. And the person that was tasked at the NYPD to resolve that challenge was this guy, Mitch Silber. Mitch Silber was in finance, and on 9/11, seeing where he worked every day get attacked, he decided to go back to school and to get into counterterrorism. And so he graduated from Columbia University, the very school that I would go on to graduate later, and became hired as NYPD's Director of Intelligence Analysis, and was responsible for building out the infrastructure to monitor the impacts of my organization. This is an individual that every day would wake up for a long portion of his career with my name on his desk. When I first went and changed, the NYPD wanted to see if I was sincere. So I was doing an investigation, and they sent one of their informants to inform on me as to whether or not they gauged my sincerity. And Mitch heard from the informant that, yeah, he really did change. It's actually real. And so Mitch was shocked. And the minute that I went public, me and Mitch started to conversate. He became a support. He was really supportive and accepted the fact that I could change. And this is a person who knows a lot about my life and what has plagued it behind closed doors. We developed a friendship that led us to write a paper together for New America Foundation on some of the sustained legacy of that period of time that me and Mitch were both active in. We thought, writing together from the perspective of a counterterrorism official and a former extremist would give insight, that was unique. And in fact, it definitely did. And in the course of talking about that and looking at what society was doing to combat extremism, Mitch and I realized that they didn't understand a lot of the complexities, and that there were things that needed to be done that weren't being done. And so we shot forth the idealistic dream of putting together an organization that would do this stuff, that would combat violent extremism of all varieties and all types, and do it in innovative, new, creative ways, thinking about how you can not just tell individuals they shouldn't be extremists, but offer them something that gives the same sense of belonging and sense of self-worth, sense of identity, sense of community that extremists offer their recruits. And we've built out quite successful number of activities, and we're continuing to operate, and hopefully we'll be able to scale up what we've been doing. But it's a story that for me is really rewarding, because I've never said this publicly before, but Mitch is as close a thing, and we don't have like day-to-day conversations. It's not like this, but just the simple fact of being able to work with him, having him support me, having him overcome all of what I used to be, and to see me as a person who's capable of changing, is the closest thing to an actual father. I have a dad. I don't have a father. It's the closest thing to a father I've actually ever had. And even though it's not that substantive, I think it's indicative of the fact that sometimes if we just engage with people on a level, like Mitch does with me, so to say, even little things can mean the world to people that have never experienced them before.
Indeed, they can. And speaking of dads and fathers, are your parents still around? And what is your relationship with them if they are today?
So they finally were, my father was finally able to take out a loan and divorce my mother shortly after I left home in 2001 or 2002. So they're divorced, and it's been, difficult for me to retain contact. I have established a decent relationship with my father. I have gotten to a point with my mother where, we don't talk about anything of depth, but I do keep in contact with her maybe once every couple of months. It's difficult for me to go home and to throw myself back into, it basically re-traumatizes me to be in her physical presence. Whether I realize that or not, I recognize it, two days after I leave. It's not healthy. However, I have come to understand that the causes behind the abuse that she inflicted upon me are much more complex, and that's allowed me to attribute it to, somewhat at least, biological mental health, and to get to a degree of forgiveness that's healthy.
And your siblings, are they doing okay?
My sister almost died from bulimia. She has severe mental health complications as a result of the abuse, but she did slowly but surely. Her physical ailments are really severe as a consequence, but she has become a ceramicist or a potterist, lives in upstate New York, is very happy. My brother lives a life where he hasn't really necessarily had an opportunity to process the trauma, but he's doing okay. He's stable financially and things of that nature, but is a little bit of has a fractured self, so to say. So you can see in the dynamics between myself and my sister and my brother that the abuse lingers, but you live, you learn, and you move on,
Right on. So let me conclude by asking you, because I just have to ask you as a musician myself, what is your favorite Grateful Dead song?
So for those that know the Dead, it would be Wharf Rat.
Wharf Rat, yeah. Well, there are some bands called Wharf Rat named after that song.
Yeah.
I think my favorite is Truckin'.
Yeah, Truckin's beautiful.
Yeah. Too. Well, Jesse Morton, I personally want to thank you, not only for your turnaround and your transparency, but also for sharing your whole story and your knowledge. And thank you for the work in countering violent extremism so that we all can live happily ever after. I hope we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, and thank you for your work, too. It's an honor to be able to work alongside of you sometimes to do this. It's great. Rewarding as well.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, folks, that wraps it up. I'm your host, Daryl Davis. Hope you all will tune in next time for
Changing Minds.